In the 1960s, over 16,000 steam locomotives in Britain were sentenced to death by a single government decree. Most were destroyed forever. But in one forgotten Welsh scrapyard, nearly 300 engines sat rusting, awaiting the cutter's torch. What happened next transformed the fate of British steam, saving a legacy everyone thought was doomed. The startling reason behind this rescue isn't what you would expect. Steam locomotives once thundered across Britain, their smoke trailing over city rooftops and country fields alike. But in 1955, British Railways unveiled a plan that would erase these iron giants from the landscape. The modernization plan, released as an official government policy, promised a swift transition to diesel and electric power. For the steam fleet, it was a death sentence written in cold bureaucratic language. An end not just to a technology, but to an entire way of life. Over 16,000 steam locomotives were scheduled for withdrawal. The numbers were staggering. Engines that had hauled troops through wartime, carried families on holiday, and stitched together the nation's industry, all now consigned to obsolescence. The scale of the operation was unmatched in British railway history. Withdrawal notices arrived at depots almost weekly. By the early 1960s, entire classes vanished from service in a matter of months. Locomotive sheds, once bustling with the hiss of steam and the clang of metal, fell silent as engines lined up for their final journeys, not to distant towns but to scrapyards. Official press releases spoke of progress and efficiency, but for railway workers and communities, the reality was stark. The familiar sight of smoke curling above the tracks faded. Engineers, firemen, and fitters faced redundancy or retraining. Children who had grown up waving at passing trains watched as their local engines disappeared, one by one. The withdrawal program moved with relentless speed. By 1968, the last scheduled mainline steam service would run, closing a chapter that had lasted over a century. The condemned locomotives were not just numbers on a ledger. Each represented years of craftsmanship, tradition, and memory. Yet as the policy took hold, most were loaded onto flat wagons and shipped off to private scrapyards scattered across the country. There they waited in long rows, their paintwork peeling, their wheels rusting, their fate sealed by a government decree. For the vast majority, there would be no reprieve. The cutter's torch awaited. But in the midst of this national purge, a handful of engines would find themselves somewhere unexpected, a place where, for reasons no one could have predicted, their story was not quite finished. Barry Island, a small port town on the coast of South Wales, became the unlikely center of Britain's steam locomotive afterlife. Tucked behind rows of warehouses and wind-battered fences, the Woodham brothers' scrapyard stretched across the edge of Barry Docks. Here, from 1959 to 1968, a steady procession of condemned engines arrived by rail, each one shunted into a growing forest of iron and rust. Delivery logs recorded the relentless influx: 4 locomotives in March 1959, dozens more each year, until the total reached 297 by the end of the decade. The yard itself was a maze of sidings and broken track, every inch crowded with the hulks of once proud machines. Engines stood buffer to buffer, their numbers chalked on battered smokebox doors, their names, if they still had them, fading beneath layers of grime and salt. Some were Great Western workhorses, others Southern region giants, all stripped of their purpose and left exposed to the biting sea air. Rain pooled in fireboxes, moss crept along running boards, and the scent of oil lingered where fitters had once labored. From above, the scale was staggering. Rows of black and green stretched for hundreds of yards, punctuated by the occasional tender or pile of wagon frames. By 1965, the yard held more than 65 new arrivals in a single year, the highest annual total. The backlog grew as British Railways cleared out its depots, and Barry became the final stop for engines from across the country, some barely a decade old, others survivors of 2 world wars. Locomotives arrived with their last journeys carefully logged, GWR 5312, 5360, 5392, and 5397 on a cold day in March 1959. A cluster of Southern Region engines arrived in the mid-60s, their paint still bearing the scars of hard service. Each one was shunted into line, their steam long since spent. The scrapyard was never silent. The clang of metal, the distant hum of the docks, and the cries of gulls formed a soundtrack for this mechanical graveyard. Yet for all the noise, the engines themselves stood mute, monuments to a vanished era, waiting in the salt-laden air for whatever fate would come next. By 1968, with 297 locomotives crowding the yard, Barry Island had become the largest single collection of condemned steam engines in Britain. Their sheer numbers packed so tightly together made the place feel less like a scrapyard and more like a stranded fleet, an accidental archive of British engineering, rusting by the sea. Woodham stood at the center of a scrapyard operation that was anything but ordinary. By the mid-1960s, his yard at Barry Island was filling at an astonishing rate. British Railways kept sending condemned steam locomotives, but they were not the only arrivals. Freight wagons, thousands of them, piled up across the sidings, each one a candidate for the cutter's torch. The question was not which engines to save, but which scrap to tackle first. For Woodham, the answer was as practical as it was unexpected. Locomotives, with their heavy frames and thick, riveted boilers, demanded a skilled workforce and hours of backbreaking labor. Cutting up a single engine could take weeks, and the process was fraught with hazards. Pressurized tanks, asbestos lagging, and stubborn steel that dulled saws and wore out men. Wagons, on the other hand, were simple. Most were made of lighter materials, bolted together rather than riveted, and could be taken apart quickly with far less risk. A team could strip several wagons in the time it took to break down one locomotive. The scrap value per ton was comparable, but the turnover was much faster. By autumn 1965, the economics were impossible to ignore. The steel industry's appetite for scrap was booming, and British Railways contracts favored yards that could process high volumes. Dye's crews found that wagon after wagon could be cut, sorted, and shipped out with a speed that kept the cash flowing and the workforce busy. Locomotives, meanwhile, were shuffled to the far end of the yard. Cutting them up was simply not worth the trouble when easier work paid just as well. The backlog of engines grew, row upon row, their numbers chalked on smokebox doors, their wheels slowly sinking into the gravel. Woodham's decision was not driven by nostalgia. He ran a business, not a museum. Yet his choice to prioritize wagons created a peculiar situation. While other scrapyards across Britain turned steam engines into piles of twisted metal, at Barry the locomotives lingered. They rusted in the salty air, exposed to the elements but untouched by the torch. For years their fate hung in the balance, dictated not by sentimental value, but by the cold logic of labor costs and market demand. This accidental pause would have consequences no one foresaw. As the 1960s wore on, word began to spread among railway enthusiasts that Barry was different. Here, in a corner of South Wales, the condemned engines of Britain's steam age were not vanishing overnight. They were waiting, forgotten by officialdom, ignored by commerce, but still standing. The yard became a silent archive, its future uncertain, its possibilities just beginning to be noticed. By the late 1960s, a quiet rumor began to ripple through the ranks of railway enthusiasts. While scrapyards across Britain had already sent their last steam engines to the torch, word spread that Barry Island was different. There, behind tangled fences and stacks of wagon frames, hundreds of locomotives still stood intact, untouched by the cutter's flame. For those who had grown up with the sound of the whistle and the rhythm of steel wheels, it was an irresistible discovery. Enthusiasts started making pilgrimages to Barry, notebooks in hand, weaving between the rusting giants to record numbers and peer at builders' plates. The scale was overwhelming, but so was the sense of possibility. Here, engines that had vanished everywhere else lingered in the salty air, their fates not yet sealed. The news traveled quickly, carried by magazine articles, word of mouth, and the growing network of preservation societies. Letters crisscrossed the country, and meetings were called in back rooms and village halls. The idea took hold. If these engines could be bought, perhaps they could be saved. But the challenge was enormous. Locomotives were not cheap, even as scrap. Most groups were made up of young volunteers, students, and working men. People with more passion than money. Fundraising became a test of ingenuity and determination. Raffles, jumble sales, and appeals in enthusiast magazines brought in small sums. Some groups pooled their savings. Others persuaded local businesses or railway clubs to chip in. Every pound mattered. The first real breakthrough came in September 1968. After months of negotiation and scraping together funds, a group of preservationists purchased Midland Railway 3835 class number 43924. The transaction was more than a sale. It was a spark. The engine was loaded onto a low loader and towed out of Barry, not to be melted down, but to begin a new life in preservation. The sight of an engine leaving the yard intact sent a jolt through the preservation community. If one could be saved, why not more? Volunteer groups multiplied. Each one chose a target, an engine with a particular history or a type that had disappeared everywhere else. They formed committees, opened bank accounts, and published newsletters. The logistics were daunting. Engines had to be inspected, their condition assessed, deals struck with Woodham, and transport arranged. Some locomotives sat deep within the maze of the yard, hemmed in by rows of wagons and other hulks. Extracting them required careful planning, teamwork, and sometimes a bit of luck. Every departure was a victory. Engines left Barry on the backs of lorries, bound for workshops and sheds across the country. The movement grew, fueled by the hope that even the most derelict locomotive might steam again. By the end of 1968, the first wave of rescues had begun. The scrapyard, once a graveyard, was becoming something else, a proving ground for a generation determined to keep steam alive. The work was only beginning. Each engine saved was a testament to the grit of volunteers who refused to let Britain's railway heritage vanish without a fight. Salt air gnawed at every inch of metal. Wheels that once thundered across the Pennines now sat fused to rails, their bearings seized tight by years of corrosion. Paint peeled in ragged strips, exposing steel pitted so deeply that in places daylight shone through. For the volunteers who arrived at Barry with wrenches and optimism, the challenge was not just mechanical. It was a battle against time, decay, and the weight of history. Each extraction demanded ingenuity. Locomotives were wedged buffer to buffer, some hemmed in so tightly that moving one meant relaying track or even dismantling parts of neighboring engines. There were no working sidings leading out. Every rescue meant improvising solutions on the spot. Teams studied the yard's labyrinthine layout, measuring clearances to the inch, plotting routes for cranes and low loaders. Sometimes they worked for days just to free a single locomotive, jacking up frames, greasing axles that had not turned in decades, and coaxing wheels to roll one last time. The case of LMS Black 5 number 45337 stands as a testament to their persistence. Delivered to Barry in January 1966, it languished for 17 years in the open, its motion gear stiffened by rust, its boiler scarred by deep pitting. By the early 1980s, experts dismissed it as a lost cause. Yet in 1983, a group known as 26B Railway Company saw potential where others saw only scrap. Over weeks of careful preparation, they worked through seized bolts and corroded bearings, documenting each part in repair logs. The engine's cab was little more than a skeleton, but its wheels, once freed, still turned. On the day of extraction, hydraulic jacks and brute force combined to inch 45337 out of its resting place, past rows of silent hulks, and onto a waiting low loader. This was not an isolated victory. Each successful rescue at Barry required a blend of engineering skill and sheer stubbornness. Volunteers faced boilers so thin they crumbled at a touch, fireboxes filled with rainwater, and motion gear fused solid. Yet with every engine hauled out of the rusting ranks, they proved that even the most derelict relic could be coaxed back to life with enough patience and resolve. The scrapyard became a proving ground where the limits of restoration were tested and again surpassed. Out of the 297 steam locomotives that once crowded the sidings at Barry, 213 escaped the cutter's torch. This single scrapyard, intended as a final stop, became the unlikely wellspring of Britain's steam preservation movement. Each engine saved from Barry carried the scars of long years exposed to the sea air, corroded frames, missing fittings, numbers barely visible beneath layers of rust. Yet against every prediction, these derelict hulks began a second life. From the late 1960s through the 1980s, the departures became a quiet procession. Engines were coaxed from their resting places, loaded onto low loaders, and hauled away to sheds and workshops scattered across the country. Some left in pieces, others little more than skeletons. Volunteers tracked each rescue, marking milestones as the tally grew. The 50th, the 100th, the 200th. By the time the last locomotive rolled out of Barry in August 1988, GWR 5700, class number 9628, the yard's role had shifted from graveyard to cradle. The final departure was not a grand ceremony, but it resonated with everyone who had fought to save these machines. The impact of Barry's survivors is woven through the fabric of Britain's heritage railways. Engines once written off as scrap now haul trains packed with families on summer weekends. GWR Halls and Manners, LMS Black Fives, Southern Pacifics, and BR Standards, all classes once considered extinct, returned to steam, pulling carriages along preserved lines from Devon to the Scottish borders. Some became celebrities in their own right, starring in films or carrying royal passengers. Others quietly clocked up thousands of miles in preservation. Their stories told by the volunteers who rebuilt them bolt by bolt. No other scrapyard in the world matched Barry's contribution. The 213 locomotives rescued here represent more than half of all British mainline steam engines preserved today. Without the accidental pause created by Woodham's pragmatic business sense, the backbone of the heritage railway movement would simply not exist. The legacy is not just in metal and steam, but in the living history that draws visitors, inspires new generations, and keeps the memory of Britain's steam age alive. Today, more than 200 steam locomotives operate because a scrapyard hesitated. Heritage railways now welcome millions each year, fueling local economies and inspiring new engineers. What survives isn't just metal, it's proof that preservation can hinge on a single, unlikely choice. In an age obsessed with progress, sometimes the future depends on what we choose to keep. Share your thoughts or memories below. What would you save for tomorrow?